What's up, everybody? This is Just Wayne, and welcome to the Just Wayne Show. And I today want to talk to you about how we can have some honest dialogue after the election. I know that for a lot of us, myself included, I had to go through all five stages of grief. And in the midst of me going through all five stages of grief, I saw people getting on the internet and getting on television and suggesting that the real reason why Democrats lost was because they went woke. And so maybe we just need to abandon all of this woke stuff. And in the process of that overreaction, we eliminated the ability to have some clear, nuanced conversations. And so today, I want to talk about how I'm over the overreaction. There is nothing that I wouldn't do.
For your attention, please. Can I have your attention, please? Everybody just look at me. Everybody just look at me. I day trade attention. Shout out to Gary V. Respond to every mention. You can find me on your FYP.
The inspiration for today's episode is a speech I saw Hakeem Jeffries give to the press, in which he laid out, I think, a really clear sense of what did and didn't happen and how we can best move forward. Take a listen.
It's not an entirely comprehensive take to look at the election results, particularly at the statewide level, and suggest that Democrats are a coastal party. There are 7 presidential battleground states. 7. Georgia had no statewide elections, meaning with respect to statewide elections outside of the presidential contest, there were 6 battleground states. Everyone agrees broadly reflects where the American people perhaps are at in terms of swing voters. 6, not including Georgia. Senator Casey was unfortunately defeated in Pennsylvania, and more than $100 million in outside money was spent against him, but he was defeated. That's one presidential state in terms of the battleground. What happened in the other 5? Well, in North Carolina, notwithstanding the fact that Donald Trump won presidential level, Democrats won the governor's race, the lieutenant governor's race, the attorney general race, the secretary of state race, and the state Supreme Court in North Carolina on that very same day that Donald Trump won the presidential election. We on the run, state of North Carolina. What happened in Wisconsin? On the same day that Donald Trump won at the presidential level, Tammy Baldwin was reelected. Are we on the run in Wisconsin, in the heartland of the United States of America, when Tammy Baldwin won with a Republican president winning at the top of the ticket? What happened in Michigan, another heartland state? Lisa Slotkin won the Senate seat and is on her way to the United States Senate. Are we on the run in the heartland state of Michigan? What happened in Nevada? Donald Trump wins the presidential election, but on the same day, same set of voters, Jackie Rosen is reelected to the United States Senate. Are we on the run in Nevada? And in Arizona, and by the way, in Nevada, all 3 House Democratic incumbents reelected. And in Arizona, Donald Trump wins somewhat convincingly at the presidential level. But Ruben Gallego is on his way to the United States Senate. Same day, same set of voters, same election. So there were 6 battleground states that had statewide elections outside of the presidential election. Democrats swept 5 and only lost in Pennsylvania. That doesn't sound to me like we need a complete makeover. Thanks, everyone.
First of all, I really like Hakeem Jeffries. He's an excellent orator. Second of all, This speech stood in stark contrast to everything I've heard from the last 5 weeks, in which you would think that Democrats got steamrolled and everything they've ever done in the history of democratic dumb is wrong. And what you're seeing is that the conversation has moved to wondering who should be in leadership. The conversation is around what's the future. The conversation around what has happened in the past is being driven by mostly cisgender, heterosexual, white men, for whom Donald Trump being in office or Kamala Harris being in office actually has very little consequence. But these cisgender, heterosexual white men are suggesting that the only way to obtain and maintain power is to abandon any policies that would uplift marginalized groups of people in order to make sure that they win elections. This, my friends, regardless of left or right, regardless of political affiliation, is white supremacy. The idea that white people should focus on white people and that white people and everyone else should focus on trying to win white people in order to maintain power is the root of white supremacy. And the wild thing about it is that these cisgender, heterosexual white people on the left see elections as wins and losses, not as the reality of rights being lost, the experience of being American when you don't have those privileges being made worse by the outcomes of these elections. And somehow, because they only see it as wins and losses, they're able to immediately think that it's okay to abandon the ideals of empathy in order to attain power, which makes them equivalent to the very forces they think that they're fighting against. I think this is because, despite the leftism, a lot of white people have not deconstructed the impact of white supremacy in their own life, because they would much rather uphold white supremacy to have power than to move away from it in order to be there for all of the people who are Americans as well. Now, let me take a step back for a second. When I talk about white supremacy, I think it's important to recognize that white supremacy is held up by a series of systems: racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. I've developed this thing called a framework definition, and I call it the framework definition because I believe you could pick any ism and stick it in this framework and it'll work. The framework is this: that blank is the systems and structures that are created in ways that are prejudiced against and excluding of insert marginalized group. That's part one of the framework definition. Part two is that individual actions are born out of a system that empowers an ideology of superiority or inferiority based on marginalized group. For example, racism is the systems and structures that are created in ways that are prejudiced against and excluding of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And that individual actions are born out of a system that empowers an ideology of superiority or inferiority based on race. Or sexism is the systems and structures that are created in ways that are prejudiced against and excluding of women. Pretty particularly women, but let's also include non-binary folks. And that individual actions are born out of a system that empowers an ideology of superiority or inferiority based on gender. Do you understand what I'm saying? Ableism is the systems and structures that are created in ways that are prejudiced against and excluding of people who are disabled. And that individual actions are born out of a system that empowers an ideology of superiority or inferiority based on ability. White supremacy is upheld by these systems and structures that empower ideologies that lead to individual actions. So the systems and structures are upholding white supremacy, and that individual actions by people are born out of systems that are empowering an ideology of superiority or inferiority based on that particular group. So for about 25 years, what we saw was that there was an attempt to push against these systems and structures, and there was an attempt to improve our individual actions that had previously been empowered by old systems but could be empowered by new systems. By that, I mean, for 25 years, I would say through the 90s, the 2000s, and the early 2010s, what we saw was a push towards trying to make our individual actions in regards to race better, our individual actions in regards to sex better, our individual actions in regards to the LGBTQ community better, the individual actions in regards to ableism better. We saw pushes and advancement. In that time, race relations improved. Access to opportunities for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color improved. Access to opportunities for women improved. People who are lesbian or gay were able to marry the people that they loved. Trans visibility came into the picture, and we saw advances in not only the language we use around ableism, but the access to different systems and services. In the 90s, the 2000s, and the first part of the 2010s, we saw this push, and some people called it political correctness. I call it empathy. In the course of that time, we saw a push to try to improve the experience for everyone. And in that time, we saw how there was one group of people who thought we hadn't gone far enough. And there was another group of people who thought we had gone way too far, who thought that any advancement to uplift people based on their race, people based on their sex, people based on their sexual orientation, people based on their gender identity, people based on their ability was somehow denigrating to other groups of people. And many of us saw the election of Donald Trump as the response to those 25-ish years of progress. As a matter of fact, Donald Trump ran on being the anti-politically correct. And people would say, I like him. He doesn't speak with all that political correct talk. He's really just telling it as he is. And telling it as it is for them means racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. And you, if you sit and think about it for 2 seconds and maybe do a Google search and a half, can find Donald Trump being racist, Donald Trump being sexist, Donald Trump being homophobic, Donald Trump being transphobic, and Donald Trump being ableist. The ableism one jumps out at me. I thought his election should have been over in the first place when he was mocking that disabled reporter. Like, when he said you could just grab him by the whatchamacallit. Like, look at my African American over there. You know, the blacks, they frankly love me. I'm the best president since Abraham Lincoln, frankly. Maybe even better than Honest Abe, right? There's all of these different ways in which he has exemplified the antithesis of progress. That he has been the embodiment of racism, the embodiment of sexism, the embodiment of homophobia, the embodiment of transphobia, and the embodiment of ableism, which means that Donald Trump is the physical walking embodiment of white supremacy. Because if you remember a second ago, I said that racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism are the pillars, are the systems that uphold and maintain white supremacy. So here we were, after 25 years of progress, seeing these systems moving forward, and then Donald Trump gets elected in the great response to that progress. And there's still an attempt to this day to try to make all of this work. Try to continue to push forward, but any pushes forward in race relations and sexism, in homophobia and transphobia has now moved from being called politically correct to being called woke. And the battle against wokeness is not just something that's political. It is something that has infiltrated almost every area of American society. You don't believe me? It has infiltrated our conversations about sports. I saw a video today as Caitlin Clark was doing this piece for Time Magazine in which she talked about how much she appreciates the history of the WNBA and recognizes that the WNBA has been built on the backs of Black women players. And that she also can acknowledge that while she's grateful to be a part of the success that the NBA is seeing, she also knows that some of that success comes from her own places of privilege. And I have watched people lose their collective minds over the idea that Caitlin Clark would suggest that there were Black women who were doing good in the WNBA before she got there. Oh, Caitlin Clark's going woke. Oh, Caitlin Clark's getting political. I can't support all this politics stuff. Mind you, these are the same folks that had no problem with Nick Bosa wearing a Make America Great Again hat at a press conference that wasn't even for him. But how dare Caitlin Clark acknowledge her privilege? That's made up. There's no such thing. Racism. Upholding white supremacy in athletics. And you got sexism. There's just been this whole online discourse because ESPN had 3 female reporters talking about college football. And guys have been online like, nobody wants to see this. Nobody wants to see 3 women talk about college football. And I'm like, bro, You couldn't make the team either if you wanted to. What are we talking about? Is your suggestion or assertion that because they didn't play, they can't talk about it? Then 95% of the guys who throw stuff at the TV every week, who'd say that they only didn't make JV football because something happened to their knee. No, it's because you sucked. And for some reason, that's an acceptable way to go out. But these women who are journalists, who are masters at their craft, who know more football than you do, because they're women, they can't talk about it. It's sexism, upholding white supremacy in sports. Transphobia, my God. The Republicans ran an entire campaign on protecting women's sports while simultaneously running a campaign saying they're going to eliminate the Department of Education. And the Department of Education enforces Title IX, and Title IX is the only reason why women's sports are funded equitably. And here it is. Piers Morgan continues to prop out the lie that the woman who won the boxing championship at the Olympics was not born a woman, when in fact she was. It has been debunked so many times, and yet Piers Morgan still gets on TV and still says the same thing. The disgusting display of transphobia and hysteria that was the political ads that were run talking about they're going to let these men in the girls' bathrooms and locker rooms. Like, this isn't even based in reality. But transphobia, upholding white supremacy in sports. It's infuriating as a person who advocates for the marginalized, as a person who sees myself as empathetic. But white supremacy has done such a number on people's brains that they don't see the need to be empathetic, which is also kind of frustrating for me, if I could just go on a soapbox for a second, because some of the instances I just named, the people who are doing the most talking about this online, when you click on their profile, the first thing you see is Christian. Now, hi, my name is Wayne, and I have a degree in biblical and theological studies. I had to translate the entire New Testament from Greek. I was a pastor for 10 years. What is so frustrating for me is that the least empathetic person you probably know is also a Christian. When the entire gospel centers around this idea of empathy. Like, when you think about the idea that Jesus says, I will separate you and I will say to one group, I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, you didn't give me drink. I was naked, you didn't clothe me. And they'll say, when did we do this to you, Lord? And he says, what you've done to the least of these, my brethren, who you've done to me. And then John, the apostle, says, you cannot possibly say that you love God, who you have not seen, and yet you do not love your brother. Like, the entirety of the New Testament is repeatedly saying you need to love people. And if you don't want to get to the New Testament, you can go to the Old Testament when the prophet Amos says to the people of Israel that God is not hearing your songs. He's not hearing your worship. He is not accepting your sacrifices. He's not participating in your festivals because you are not doing justice. You are oppressing the widow and the orphan and the poor. And somehow, some way, the entire Bible, which from Genesis to Revelation lays out this viewpoint that there is God who's going to do what God does, and your responsibility is to love people. Your responsibility is to be there for those who are oppressed. The entire Bible lays that out as a thesis statement. And somehow the least empathetic people are the ones who their first thing in their bio is Christian. If Jesus were to judge Christians according to the book they read, devotionals in the Bible app in every day, almost every Christian I know is going to hell. And that should be scary. Because the reality is, the most judgmental, the least empathetic, the least caring, while at the same time, believing somehow that lifting up America is God's will, tells me that you don't worship God. You worship white supremacy. And if we're being very clear, this was always the outcome that was going to happen. I saw a TikTok, and I'll try to link it in the show notes, where this person said that their Roman Empire, that the Roman Empire never collapsed. It just became the Roman Catholic Church. And that made a lot of sense to me because all the imagery began to develop from being this ancient Near Eastern religion with a brown Messiah to the reality that almost every image that you see of Jesus and the apostles today looks like a Roman citizen. How did we get there? But I digress. White supremacy upheld in all of these different facets. Politically, from a sports perspective, in education, is always trying to make people focus on othering people by their race, othering people by their sex, othering people by their orientation, othering people by their gender identity, othering people by their ability, so that people won't sit back and focus on the biggest issue of all, which is class. The reality is that class solidarity would be interracial. Class solidarity would look at the corporations who are systematically trying to own the political system and to push us further and further and further into debt to them. That is not a white or black issue. That is an everybody but rich folks issue. And when class solidarity existed at one point across races, we saw moves to make sure that white supremacy was upheld and that other groups were castigated. For example, there's the Gloucester County conspiracy that happened in 1663, or the Bacon Rebellion that happened in 1676. Both of these were a collection of slaves and indentured servants across races who fought against the tobacco overlords and the cotton overlords in order to try to make sure that they had rights, that they were not treated poorly. And this was across the board. And what happens is in 1705, both of these were in Virginia. In 1705, you have what are called the Virginia Slave Codes. And a part of these Virginia Slave Codes, the servitude was passed down through the mother, almost guaranteeing that slaves would be in perpetuity black. Now, while you have, on the one hand, this class solidarity that's interracial against the corporate overlords, once you have a group of people that can be the permanent underclass who are black, you can then control the lowest caste of people within whiteness. Because what these corporations, what these plantation owners, what these politicians were able to do is they were able to convince poor white Southerners that enslaved Africans were their enemy, so that they would not look at the very ones who were making all of the money. They were being told that the black enslaved folks were free labor, and those black slaves are the reason why you can't get a job. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like this idea of an invasion of all these immigrants who are coming across the border and stealing your jobs? Not recognizing that in that time, the slave owners were ensuring that slavery was maintained so they did not have to pay those poor Southerners to do agricultural work. In the same way that the corporations are ensuring the immigration problem remains the way that it is, to have a permanent underclass of people who you can hire for lower wages. This is not the people who are crossing the border's fault. This is the people who are hiring them and paying them at wages. They need them to remain illegal in order to continue to pay them at those wages. Poor white Southerners were taught that those Negroes were inferior because they don't speak the language, because of all these physical features they have, because they're uneducated. While at the same time, those same wealthy Southerners were not wanting there to be public schools that would properly educate those poor white Southerners' children. Sound familiar? Sound like the way that Republican politicians are pushing for school voucher programs, knowing that in the state of Arkansas, for example, Governor Huckabee Sanders signs a voucher program into law, which gutted the Arkansas public school system that is already ranked at the bottom in this country, only to give vouchers to people who can already afford to send their kids to the few private schools. And so blaming someone else while giving money to the wealthy to overeducate their children, while taking funding away from the poor white Southerners' educational advancements. White supremacy is the reality for rich white people. And it is the illusion that keeps poor white people angry at the wrong race, the wrong sex, the wrong gender, the wrong orientation, or the wrong ability. Poor white folks will work to maintain racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. They will work to uphold it, not recognizing the common enemy. That is the greatest con of it all. Like, somehow, someway, Southern states believe that Donald Trump, a man from New York, who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, got a loan of a couple $1 million, built a business with his father, inherited more money, has been able to con his way through all of these different business ventures, that somehow that man cares about the common people. Whereas so many poor people in the inner city, so many immigrants actually share the values and the experience of these poor Southern white folks, of these North Dakota and South Dakotan white folks. They share the values and the experiences at the same time. These white folks have been convinced that black folks are the issue, that feminism is the issue, that gay folks are the issue, that trans folks are the issue, that being too politically correct about ableism is the issue. And so when I see people get on television and say, if the Democrats just abandoned woke, they'd win elections, I'm like, of course you think that. You succeed. You get wealthy off of this. These aren't realities for you like it is for all of us. And you are maintaining and upholding white supremacy in the process. Because the policies that would support black folks, indigenous folks, folks of color, trans folks, queer folks, poor folks, disabled folks, the policies that would focus in and empower those groups of people, those policies are for everybody. Except for the illusion that comes from white supremacy. So, let's be clear. Kamala Harris lost. Now, do I think that she should be the front runner in 2028? Without question. Without question. Once the numbers finally came in, you saw that she didn't get beat that bad. Like, once the numbers were all counted, I promise you, Tuesday night, I was like, what is happening? But now that it's all said and done, Donald Trump had one of the smallest victories in the modern era. Kamala Harris had 100 days to run a campaign, and she had 2 anchors on her. One of those anchors being an unpopular incumbent president who should have stepped down earlier. And that is what it is. I don't actually blame Joe Biden for that. The second anchor is a political disaster that is the conflict in Gaza. And in 100 days, with a concerted campaign by folks on the left to try to get people not to either vote or not vote for Kamala Harris, and obviously the right campaigning to get their guy elected. In the midst of all that, she came close. She should be the front runner in 2028. But as Hakeem Jeffries said at the beginning of this podcast episode, Kamala Harris lost to Donald Trump. Democrats didn't get shellacked like everyone's acting like they did. There's something else that's happening here. There's something bigger at play. And that is, without maybe realizing it, these talking heads are making white supremacists point for them. And I personally would invite them to absolutely shut up. And read the room and talk about the elephant in the room, which is Donald Trump, who lied to the American people and will never be held accountable. Donald Trump has never truly been held accountable in his life. He lied to the American people. That was his campaign strategy. It wasn't that Kamala's policies weren't popular. There was a study that was done that took the names off the policies. And when the names were taken off the policies, Kamala Harris's policies were found to be more popular in polling than Donald Trump's. It's that Donald Trump somehow, some way, has never and will never be held accountable for his actions. I actually know exactly why. It's because despite our best efforts, we have and will seemingly always uphold white supremacy. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Today's podcast episode was written by me, Just Wayne. The intro music was also by me, Attention, by Just Wayne. If you enjoyed today's podcast, I encourage you to share it with somebody and engage with me on socials. It's Just Wayne Creative on all social platforms. I'll be back again on Monday talking about whatever's happening in the world. Until then, thanks for coming to my TED Talk.